It is an honor to now invite to the stage the moderator of our next session, the Los Angeles Bureau Chief for Reuters, Mary Milliken.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here today. I am the Los Angeles Bureau Chief for the Reuters news agency. I've been a journalist for 40 years, and of those 40 years, 26 of them I have worked for Reuters. It's an amazing organization. And I was very lucky to have an international career. For 25 years, I worked in Spain, Portugal, Brazil, and Argentina, all countries which had dictatorships, and I was there to see their democracies flourish, so it was very inspiring. Before we get started with our panel, I want to thank the first panel for the incredible, thought-provoking discussion. It was really great. Thank you, Nicholas Kristof, for moderating that. And I am a resident of Glendale, California, and so I need to do a shout out for my Armenian neighbors. I have a deep and abiding respect for the Armenian community in Glendale. They thrive economically, culturally, they help each other, they know how to generate political support. Every family business in Glendale has a picture of the owners with Adam Schiff, and you know what Adam Schiff did for the Armenians in Washington. I also, at Reuters, I run our immigration coverage, and when I think about a community that has done so well and thrived, I think about the Armenians. It's really an inspiration. So thank you to all of you who are here today. More recently, I was the foreign policy editor for Reuters in Washington, D.C. from 2018 to 2022. That meant I covered both the Trump and Biden administrations. And I would say our biggest story during that time was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was an incredibly important story. It was hard. It was several weeks of very difficult work. But afterwards, I went to my ancestral lands in Kentucky near Bowling Green and interviewed Afghan refugees who had arrived there from Kabul and how happy they were there in Kentucky with the big skies and all the support that they got there. And I know a lot of people think that Kentucky is a red state, although the governor is Democratic, but they felt incredibly supported there. So that was very, very inspiring. So let me invite our panelists to come sit down here. We are talking about the future of human rights. Unfortunately, the news at the beginning of this year hasn't been incredibly optimistic, but we're going to try to be optimistic. As someone who has covered the Pentagon and the State Department, I follow the news out of the State Department very closely. I'm very interested in it. This year has been difficult. We've had the dismantling of USAID. The State Department is preparing for a big reduction in costs, which will dismantle something like 100 bureaus within the State Department. And that includes bureaus that investigate war crimes and advocacy issues. And we've had attacks on DEI. We've had attacks on the LGBTQ community and defunding of health programs. So this is not an easy time to be a journalist. The news flow is like a fire hose these days. With our illustrious panel here, we're going to talk about the future of human rights. I'm an optimist, so I'm hoping that we can have an optimistic conversation. I know several of you have worked in Africa, so that's one thing that we should be talking about. So let's start with some general questions, and please just put up your hand if you feel like you have a good answer to this. How can collaboration across local, national, and international levels strengthen human rights protections for displaced and vulnerable communities? Does anyone feel like they can answer that question? John.
Well, very briefly, you know, the opportunity exists for exchanging ideas and strategies and tactics at a really difficult time. But maybe most importantly, it comes down to solidarity. I mean, the community is so under siege. To have people in the trenches with you, cross borders, transnationally, there's a lot of value to that. So I think collaboration, cross-country collaboration is a critical thing these days, and foundations can really be important. And Aurora and this gathering is the kind of thing that can really provide that safety net of collaboration.
So we talked about some of the programs that have been dismantled, but looking ahead, I'd like to know what the panelists think about what structural changes are necessary to ensure that human rights remain a guiding force in global governance and civil society. Yes, please, Unni.
First of all, thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I personally think that we have all of the conventions and treaties and institutions that we need to, you know, we've all signed on as member states on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, etc. What we see now is impunity. So, for example, 4 out of 5 Security Council members have been part of coalitions that have bombed health workers and health health facilities around the world. It's total impunity, right? So these are Security Council members. So it's not a question of whether we have the right instruments or the right institutions. It's just that member states no longer abide by them, right? And so I think Comfort talked about how things are splintering and new groupings are being formed. So that can pose opportunities, but at the same time it can also be quite dangerous because collective security arrangements that we've negotiated, all of that is sort of up in the air and being, so what's happening between India and Pakistan, we don't know where that'll go.
Oh, no.
Right? So we do have the institutions. One more thing that I will say is that there's a lot of talk about humanitarians and human rights workers finding solutions for problems. But, you know, humanitarians are in places because politics has failed, right? And there's no getting around the fact that we need the right sort of politics. Communities have to live together in peace. You know, governments have to be responsive to the needs of people, and we need to have, you know, at the highest level, a capacity to broker peace between nations. Right now, we are dysfunctioning at all levels. Right.
Yes. Yes, Safiya.
Well, let me just say that I'm not a scholar of human rights as much as I am a scholar of technology and capital. And so when you ask what is the structural response, to me, I think we're living in a moment of the failures of capitalism. We have 7 of the 10 most powerful companies in the world on planet Earth are tech companies. They are profoundly implicated in the collapse of Western liberal democracies. They are profoundly implicated in the collapsing of the public good and major institutions, from governments to other kinds of institutions that we're reliant upon. And they are also implicated in reorganizing social and human, political and economic relationships. And I think if we're going to talk about a structural analysis, and we talk, you know, to your previous question at the local level, we can see that in action. We see industries that have an outsized influence that are actually more powerful than governments and operate like nation states the way governments operate. And so I think we're going to have to take a very close look at the way in which these kinds of projects, if you will, are reorganizing our society and are deeply implicated in the erosion of human and civil rights.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
I'll pick up from where Safiya is So first of all, welcome in, everyone. It is such a pleasure and honor to have you here at UCLA, and UCLA is one of these communities where people do gather from across country and culture in pursuit of common aim. And I think that is the missive of this panel, to think about the future of human rights. I'm an international lawyer, law professor, legal scholar, and for those of us who've been studying the field of human rights, there's always a point in the timeline, 1948. That's when Eleanor Roosevelt, together with Ralph Bunche, who's an alumni of UCLA, and many others gathered around a common cause, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And rights is often the language that law expresses itself in, and it's been the language of nations for a very long time. The language of humanity is often expressed through values. I think that human rights gives us that meaning of the idea of values that we all agree matter: equality, dignity, justice, peace, and then the lens through which power brings to bear through structures to make those values a reality. I think the structural question is the right question that Mary's asking, which is, our structures of the past have served some, but certainly not all. And we are in this inflection point where we need to be developing the structures of the future. So this is the challenge for everyone who's doing their part, but how do we do our parts together collectively with the common good in mind?
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And I do have a follow-up question. How much faith do you have in the United Nations to be part of that structural rebuilding?
We'll get right into it, I see. Well, I have a United Nations authentic sign in my office, with thanks to my husband, Professor Bradley, who's here. I believe in the United Nations. And interestingly, last year, a big study done out of the Harvard Kennedy School, looking, I think it was 19 to 29-year-olds, the youth, found that the one institution where public trust is going up among that age group is the United Nations. I think that the United Nations, more than its functions, is an idea based on an ideal, and it is an ideal that we absolutely need to recommit to. Now, in full disclosure, I've worked at the United Nations twice in my career, once as formally as a U.S. delegate, and once as an independent expert on the law on racial discrimination. And I do believe, just like here today, when you bring people together across every possible way of being human, with an aim towards creating solutions, there's nothing we can't do. It's not perfect, there's a lot of room for growth and change, but I do believe in the United Nations.
Okay, I do too, and I used to cover the Secretary General when he was Prime Minister, Antonio Guterres, when he was Prime Minister of Portugal. Very decent man, I have to say. But the UN is having some funding problems, is it not?
So I hear, yes.
Unni, did you want to add something on the UN?
UN will function to the extent the member states want it to. So the problem is not necessarily with the UN itself. If member states don't want it to function, it won't function, right? So funding problem, yes. US, I think you have assess funding based on GDP and your economic sort of might. Member states contribute to the functioning of the UN. So the US contributes about 22% of the assessed funding, and next is China at 14%.
Yes.
Right? So it is not as easy for other countries to just step in and fill the gap that America has left, because we're talking about huge amounts that need to be. But having said that, UN also needs to cut some fat. I think over the last 70 years has gained some weight, picked up some bad habit, and it really needs to. So as Comfort, I think, mentioned, something good might come out of it if the member states get together and make the right decisions of what we need to do for the next 70 years, as you said. So I think we have that moment, we are at that moment where we need to collectively come together and say, okay, what kind of architecture do we want in place for the next 70 years? That means probably a massive reorganization of the multilateral system. Now, multilateral system may be, in New York and Geneva might be dysfunctioning in a big way, but you see a lot of activity in Addis Ababa, for example. African Union is got some new energy, and they are getting their act together. ASEAN, for example, out of Jakarta, they're also coming together. But of course, these are sub-regional multilateral groupings, right?
Yes.
So I think that is also something that we need to keep an eye out for, that we don't always think of it at the UN, at the what's happening in New York or what's happening in Geneva. We need to go to the regional groupings, and BRICS, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for the life of me, don't understand what brings those countries together, except for they want to de-dollarize the global economy.
Yes.
But whatever the motivations, these groups will have a lot of power and influence in the coming years.
Yes, John.
I just want to add a postscript, which, we can't deny that the Security Council, for example, has just become completely locked. The divisions are so stark, but I wonder this dynamic moment, not in a good way, where, predictably the US, UK, and France would always be on the same side, whether the US is going to go and vote with Russia on a number of things, and we've already seen a few trickling in. So it's going to be a very strange next few years, in addition to a lot of significant, serious cuts, where the institution loses a lot of its institutional knowledge and history, where the politics are going to be really, really unpredictable for the first time in a long time. They've been very predictable in a static way for so long, but I think now we may see and it won't rebound positively in anything.
Right, and the U.S. ambassador to the UN is going to be the National Security Advisor who was fired last week.
If he gets confirmed.
If he gets confirmed. But I bet he will get confirmed. I'd put money on that. John, do you have any positive thoughts about what he might be able to do?
Are you on a Signal chat group with him?
Yeah, the old Andy Kaufman routine where he just comes and sits in front of the audience for 10 minutes and just stares at them. And everybody's like, I don't really have a lot of, but I mean, if you're talking about the range of viewpoints within this administration, he's probably nearest to the conventional historical Republican viewpoint, where there's still a role for the U.S. in the world, and so. But to what extent is that going to be constrained by the new populism, that MAGA populism that has basically infected the party? So I don't have a lot of hope for this.
Okay. So one question that I do have, of course, the first 100 days of the Trump administration, there have been a lot of hardcore policies, and including deportation of immigrants with no due process. Does anyone on this panel think that as the Trump administration moves further into its tenure, that things could start to get better?
One feature of the last decade has been the willingness of Western nations to criminalize humanitarian action. So, for example, Italy took Doctors Without Borders to court for saving people from drowning in the Mediterranean.
Immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Right? And we've seen that here in the US, where people who leave water and food for people crossing the border and walking through the desert are being put in prison, etc. And we've seen this in many different forms, that criminalizing what is essentially an expression of compassion or solidarity with people who are going through a really, really difficult time. That then, becomes it's a completely different ballgame. Human rights agencies and also humanitarian organizations, I think in the last 40, 50 years, they've focused mainly on civil and political rights, but not so much on social and economic rights. And I think, and that means, you're taking positions on capitalism, you're taking positions on rising inequality, and a lot of that sort of gets into a very different way of understanding what rights are and what rights matter to people, and our willingness to sort of work on those issues. I think we've seen that maybe organizations like Oxfam have rebranded itself from humanitarian work to social justice work. And I think we need to see more of that in the coming years if we are to really work with people and address the issues that they want.
I think that ties nicely into questions about democracy. The United States has been the world's longest consecutive democracy, and there's a conundrum that we have, tension in the field of human rights between, on the one hand, the sense that democracy has proven good for human rights along certain metrics. The data shows that. There's definitely a critique of those metrics. That's a fair critique. On the other hand, there's a rising forms of non-democratic forms of governance in the world. And we respect the idea of sovereignty of nations, which has been a long-standing idea upon which the world order is organized. So how are we looking into the future of human rights going to balance different governance structures, diversity of governance structures, where democracy may not hold in terms of being the majority approach to how people want to be governed or are governed, whether they decide that's for them or not. So I think there's an important tension there that we're seeing play out in a lot of the hotspots, a lot of the tensions and conflicts, a lot of the critical dialogues that we're having in places like UCLA and other university campuses, and in cases that are going to the International Court of Justice right now, raising this core tension. Who's going to be for human rights if we're protecting a world order based on the idea of sovereign nations?
I think one thing we know also, I'm a member of the International Panel on the Information Environment, which is kind of a corollary to the IPCC, and we study the information environment, and we've seen scholars from all over the world report a rise in misinformation, propaganda, the use of different kinds of technologies to spread propaganda, and of course many of these things are used directly in service of suppressing human and civil rights or democracy. So I think we can expect to see more of that. I don't think that that's particular to the Trump administration, but certainly under this administration, for example, just in the last 100+ days, we have seen a lack of mainstream coverage of millions of people, in fact, out in the streets protesting our government's policies. And that is not something that you might be regularly seeing in your social media feeds or on mainstream news channels. And I find that incredibly interesting. In fact, if you want to get that kind of coverage now in the United States, you've got to look to international media that's covering what's happening in this country. So those kinds of things I think are really important for us to be watching, that even our ability to access knowledge and information is changing and is intensifying and actually becoming more difficult under this administration.
I don't hear much optimism here. So Unni, you have come from Nigeria, and Africa does seem to be in a bad position with the Trump administration. How worried are you about that?
Well, I think Gail and others have really laid out the consequences of the policies that are being made in Washington, but not just in Washington, also in Brussels and other parts of the world. Right? But I also see optimism. Right? I think there are a lot of people now who are talking about sort of moving away from a dependency on assistance to, okay, how can we raise enough taxes, for example? So climate funding, for example, there's a lot of talk about moving away from an ODA, reliance on overseas development assistance, to tax-based financing for adaptation and mitigation. So these conversations are happening at the moment. And I think we have to allow and support for these conversations to happen. Otherwise, the tendency is, if we are trying to replicate or bring back the old way of doing things, power will remain in the hands of few. And what we need is power to be ceded and spaces to be created for these sort of things to happen. And Africa will perhaps not be looking to America for support and assistance. They will be looking to China perhaps, or they will be looking to other parts of the world. So there's no more than one sheriff in town now.
Yes.
Right? So that it will, I don't know how all of this is going to play out, but it is going to play out in a very different way than we are used to, we have been used to for the last 50, 60 years.
Yes, and you would think that the U.S. would be concerned about the expanding influence of China, not just in Africa, but also in Latin America.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Gail said about soft power.
Yes.
And I think people misunderstand what soft power is. Soft power is absolutely crucial for any country for them to maintain their, in a way, legitimacy as a superpower. Especially superpowers need soft power more than any other countries do, because that's how they are. They can wield a stick, but at the same time, they use soft power to generate loyalty, etc. Right? We're seeing all of that breaking down now.
Right. John, you've also done work in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, it terrifies me, frankly. Comfort brought this up in a very powerful way in the first panel about the mineral diplomacy that we're conducting in Congo right now. I mean, to reduce the horrors of human suffering, the mass corruption, and the exploitation of 500 years of this territory that's now called the Congo, to go back to the roots of violent extraction as the animating principle of our policy is, it's just stunning. In Sudan, to leave the ground, or cede the ground to diplomatically to the Emiratis and the Saudis when they're, carving the place up, importing blood gold, making billions of dollars off of instability. In South Africa, to have our policy, dictated by the ICJ case. There's just so much that is horrifying to me about this moment. But yeah, the U.S. is hypocritical, historically. But we have to have, and we've always had, I think, some level of bipartisan, value-based strain in our relationship to that continent, where at least in the last 20, 30, 40 years, there's been an attempt to try to build up through trade and smart aid the nations that are, and peoples, especially peoples, through the massive assistance to civil society that's now all gone. And so I guess it is a, yeah, geez, I mean, you keep trying to fish for some optimism. We're just.
Yes, Safiya, go ahead.
I really appreciate that we've turned in this direction, because I just think it's impossible for us to sit in a room together and on one hand talk about everything John just laid out for us, and then divorce that from these other kinds of fantasies about the future of AI and how technology is somehow going to help us, when these are actually the conditions that enable these other kinds of fantasies. And if we had any kind of sense of possibility, truly, it would be that we're able to start to make these connections, and that we can see that in some parts of the world, these kind of utopian technological dreams are completely predicated upon mineral extraction. They're predicated upon profound e-waste, human rights and labor abuses in the manufacturing sector. And really, we sit in the United States, and for the most part in Europe, in a rarefied position, targeted as consumers and white-collar workers, and are unable to make these global connections. And so to me, this is kind of why I opened with talking about that sector as being so profoundly important, because it really is reliant upon all kinds of extractive models in order to flourish. So the question to me is, for those of us who sit in the United States, is to what degree can we raise our consciousness and make different choices or make much more transparent the human and civil rights abuses that are embedded in our kinds of fantasies about the future, so that we can make different choices. And that is actually something, to me, I'm incredibly optimistic about, because 15 years ago when I was having these conversations, no one could even understand that technology was political. And now we can sit here and talk about the politics of these kinds of systems and economies, and it's undeniable, in fact, that these things are linked. And that's actually the place then where we can try to imagine other kinds of futures.
Great. Well, I have a follow-up question. Given your specialization in data, how do digital technologies and data systems affect access to and violations of human rights, particularly among marginalized communities?
Well, one of the things, I mean, this is a very kind of UN-oriented conversation, and so, you know, that's one place I think for us to look at. We know that migrant communities, refugees, oppressed people, both in the United States and around the world, are always the communities upon which new technologies are experimented. And so when we look at things like border security, digital passports, digital identification, these things are often used in service of denying rights or creating multi-tiered systems of access. So we see this, you know, Tendai Acheme, who's our former UCLA Promise Institute director and professor at UCLA, wrote a magnificent series of reports about the implications of digital technologies and data and violations of human rights. And we see these things, you know, operationalized as, you know, fast passes for people who come from European nations or affluent nations, and then deep interrogation and immigration control for people who are not white or not coming from affluent countries. We see intense data collection. And one of the things that's so important about understanding mass data collection, whether it's through UN programs or other kinds of governmental programs, on one hand, certainly we know that can be used to improve human condition, improve the quality of life for people. Those of us who are researchers, our lives are dedicated to understanding the human condition. At the same time, the intense datafication of people is about turning people or understanding people as data points. Mm-hmm. And data points, of course, we know are collected at any particular moment in time. And they flatten the human experience. They actually make our understanding of each other coarse and difficult to understand. And we don't want to live in societies and communities where we live in these hyper-reductionist ways of knowing each other, of sorting each other, of classifying each other, of giving rights and denying rights upon those kinds of projects, those kinds of projects. So to me, this is where we have a lot to learn, where we study surveillance of communities of color, of poor people, of migrants, of refugees, asylum seekers. That tells us a lot about where we're going and who will be the beneficiaries and who will, in fact, be increasingly denied rights. And we have a lot of evidence, and there, again, I've referenced some of these reports and people who are doing this work, but now we have mountains of evidence, and that's actually incredibly useful and helpful for helping us navigate this moment.
Okay, to that point, in what ways are systemic bias and structural racism embedded in digital platforms, and how should human rights frameworks respond to that?
Well, one of the things we know is that some of these systems are profoundly discriminatory just in the ways in which people are misrepresented in them. We know from the work of particularly scholars who are Black women and women of color about, you know, faulty facial recognition systems, the way that censors misread people. We understand a lot about the way in which these technologies are unevenly applied. Data is collected disproportionately, again, on people who are oppressed, and it is weaponized and used against them as well. These systems also then feed in and train other systems. So it's interesting to hear people who are excited about generative AI and large language models and these kinds of things, but these are trained on discriminatory data, and there are profoundly abusive and dangerous workplaces and types of work that data cleaners in Kenya and the Philippines and other parts of the world have to engage in with this data. Data isn't just data, it's also every worst impulse that human beings have ever acted upon and committed, from violent murder and destruction to scrolling your social media feeds and everything in between. That also goes into these systems, and people have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out training data. And training data for these models is full of discrimination and harmful content. So these systems are opaque, they're difficult for people to understand, and they're also not magical. They are not even reliable. In fact, I dare say most of us in this room probably don't want to see a doctor in 5 years because medical students were trained by LLMs and used ChatGPT to get themselves through med school. You probably want a specialist who knows what they're talking about. We have tons and tons of research now about the unreliability of large language models and the hallucinations and everything else that they do. So this is the kind of the moment we're living in, which is like the hype cycle that comes out of Silicon corridors around the world about what these things can do, and that's really because that's very lucrative for them. And then there's the applied reality, and I think that the human rights community and this community that I revere and respect so much, I hope that you will take up this kind of research and knowledge and integrate it into your work so that you can be more discriminating about what these technologies can and can't do.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. Anna, let me follow up with you. What role should education systems play in fostering a deeper, more inclusive understanding of rights and responsibilities across generations?
So last year we had a panel with the legendary Marguerite Baron-Coetzee and others on the right to education at this very event. And I said then what I'll say again now. Education is a political act. I think that the world has woken up to that once again in light of the last year. Education is a political act because when you have an informed population who knows their rights and are ready to fight to embrace and have those rights be reality, the governance must change. In 1820, if we go back that far, the data that we have suggests that just under 20% of the global population received any kind of basic education. In 2020, 200 years later, the number is now 89.6% that the global population has received some kind of education. So there is optimism in the long-term trajectory of humanity, as the first panel rightly pointed out. I do think, though, it's not just the mere fact of education. It's not just that people are going to classes, there are many faculty here in the room and students here in the room in the middle of finals. It's not the mere fact of education. It's what happens to the human being when you're in a community and you're learning. It's the growing together. And this is where diversity of humanity, bringing diverse groups together to learn, is vital for education. Because you're then learning through and with one another, through different perspectives of what does the human experience look like. You cannot just bring people in to create a diverse group. You have to make it equitable and inclusive. And I came to UCLA as Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion precisely because UCLA had a mission of being the premier research university, public research university, with these as the values because they work for education. And I think that we are in a moment where there's such a backlash against some idea without delving into what are you actually afraid of? What are you worried about? How do we problem solve for the concerns while keeping what we really need to have vital, public, accessible, and inclusive education model that is available for people? Because society and humanity need education. It is the way in which, the one thing that we can do globally in which to ensure just even a better standard of living and a better way of life for many people, and especially for children and girls.
Okay. I heard some optimism there. Okay. And how can human rights law evolve to remain relevant in an era of global inequality, digital disruption, and climate stress?
So the legal field, we're having a lot of conversations around this question. And there's a couple different strands. One's about rule of law. What is rule of law? Why is it so easy to, in this moment, take away from rule of law? What can we do to protect and bolster rule of law? One conversation is around the idea that there should be human rights, and people and nations tend to agree with that in principle. But to Unni's point, what do you want to talk about? Different parts of the world are very uncomfortable talking about different kinds of human rights. Very few countries and governments are comfortable getting into family. What do parents do with children? What's the cultural norms around puberty and growing up? When are we going to talk about child marriage, female genital mutilation? These are things that have come up in cultures and come up in different ways of living. Who's to say we should have universal standard for all, or no, we need cultural relativism to let different parts of the world decide what different rights look like? I love those debates academically and in the classroom, but they forget the other piece, the principle of subsidiarity. Those most affected by the harm should be the voices centered in the development of the solution. And I think that's an easy way forward for nations that get around the UN and say, oh, don't tell us how to do the human rights in our country. Okay, no, outsiders shouldn't tell you, but insiders in your country who are most affected should be at the table, and that's what we need to see more of.
Okay. Yes, Unni.
I mean, I've been a humanitarian worker for close to 30 years now, and a lot of the places I've been to, occupying forces establishing rule of law is a big priority for them. And rule of law is about two things: protecting people and protecting property. And it's almost always protecting property that takes precedence over protecting people, right? And this is something that even when you go in with the best of intentions, the concern is about how you secure property, or oil or mineral diplomacy. Before it was oil diplomacy, right? So I think there is a disillusionment in many parts of the world with human rights, and we need to sort of work towards restoring and going back to the basic texts of human rights. Everything is a right now, right? So you need to go back to fundamental rights and then drive those points home. And we have the treaties, we have the instruments for all of that. But somehow I think, and do we take, like I come from India, here in the US, governments themselves are violating the Constitution and constitutional rights for their own citizens. Before it was a problem in other countries, now it's a problem in your own country. How are we going to deal with that? I think legal professionals, medical professionals, we all have to band together to take on sometimes our own authorities who are undermining the very good laws that we have, or the Constitution that we have. So yes. I think that's something that we need to do together.
As a reporter, one thing that I have picked up on over the years is that churches and religious institutions really are very invested in inclusivity, welcoming refugees, making sure that they get a lot of support as they establish their residency here in the United States. Have you four come across that also?
In the southern border, in the US-Mexico border, I think religious institutions are very active in welcoming, the Catholic Church as well.
Yes.
And, yeah, they've been very active in welcoming. There are different forms of compassion. When we talk about humanitarian action, we talk about, one rooted in principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence, etc. But there's also faith-based compassion. There's many different ways to express solidarity and compassion with people, and I think there needs to be space for all of that as we go forward. And faith is definitely one thing that binds people together.
Yes, absolutely. I was down on the town of Jacumba Hot Springs, which is on the San Diego, Mexico border, and people from Jacumba Hot Springs turned out to make sure that people coming around the border fence, and they were coming from all over the world. It wasn't Mexico and Central America. It was Turkey. It was Brazil. It was Haiti. It was people from Jordan. And the volunteers in that town would go out to make sure that people had water, snacks, something to eat as they waited for Border Patrol to process them. And it was actually incredibly impressive what they managed to do for those people. Yeah. John, let me ask you a few questions. What innovative models of accountability are emerging in conflict and post-conflict settings, and how effective are they in delivering justice?
I'm going to take a stab at a little optimism, if that's okay with you, Mary.
Please do.
So, I'd like to focus on two aspects of justice, delivering justice: legal accountability and financial accountability. Regarding legal accountability, I think all of us are painfully aware of the limitations of the International Criminal Court and other multilateral bodies. So I'd like to focus instead for a minute on the concept of universal jurisdiction, which allows a country to prosecute individuals for crimes committed outside the borders, particularly war crimes and crimes against humanity. 2024, there were 36 new cases opened around the world. 27 people were convicted, almost doubling the number from 2023, so the trend lines are a bit encouraging. A French court has issued an arrest warrant against Bashar al-Assad, and two other former Syrian officials from his regime were convicted in absentia in the last year. In Switzerland, a former Gambian minister was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to 20 years. But it's not just government officials who are starting to face justice. There are also criminal prosecutions of corporate actors for their complicity in grave human rights crimes. And I'll give you an example of one I've personally provided testimony for, and that is the Lundin Oil Company's involvement in Sudan. And my work during the years that Comfort and I worked together in International Crisis Group is key in providing that evidence. The board chair and the CEO of Lundin Oil are both right now on trial in Sweden for aiding and abetting war crimes in Sudan. Lundin paid the government of Sudan basically for protection, asked it to protect its oil fields, its concessions, and in response, the government of Sudan conducted repeated military campaigns into the territory where the concessions were, resulting in thousands of deaths, hundreds of thousands of people, ethnic cleansing, hundreds of thousands of people displaced, mass rape, torture, child soldier recruitment, enslavement, the worst of the worst. And this case hopefully will blaze a small trail for corporate accountability for war crimes, informed by precedents in other European trials. But I think the case is a bit unique in that it's a criminal prosecution by a European court, not an international one, of high-level executives, not just staff members, for their indirect rather than direct contribution to war crimes in a country abroad. And there's other cases ongoing in other EU courts now. Very few have concluded, so the future is cloudy but encouraging. And that's legal accountability. Now I'm going to turn for a second to financial accountability. The wheels of international justice, we all know, grind very slowly. So some years ago, we created something called the Sentry, which attempts to pursue accountability for those profiting from war crimes, from dictatorship, by going after their dirty money and the flows that go out into the international financial system. Sanctions are the best known tool of financial accountability and leverage, but it's usually their misuse, unfortunately, that has garnered attention. The general sanctions in the past that were placed on entire countries and which created tremendous civilian suffering in some cases have largely been phased out, and they've been replaced by more targeted sanctions. But in the vast majority of these targeted sanction cases, these are largely ineffective because they're often imposed on individual government officials who they aren't doing business in their own name, so they're not going to catch the financial flows. They're often few and far between, leaving the targets with the conclusion that, you know, the U.S. and European paper tigers are roaring, but they're not going to bite. However, sanctions can be a very effective tool for accountability when they're applied properly. And they're most effective, and this is really important to understand, they're most effective when sanctions are applied against entire networks. In other words, the government official at the center, most responsible for human rights abuses, but their cutouts, their businesses, their corporate footprint, basically, their facilitators and their enablers in the international financial system, all sanctioned at once. We do that when we're really serious about some geopolitical issue, but usually not for the kind of human rights issues that all of us care about. But when network sanctions are paired with anti-money laundering measures by the U.S. Treasury Department, by other finance ministries globally, that's when impact is supercharged, as it puts banks around the world on notice to not do business with these individuals and entities, and they can be shut out of the international financial system completely. That's a real measure of accountability. So the bottom line, I think, is that there really are pathways to different forms of accountability that are evolving as we speak. And so as Nubar would say, paranoid optimism, I think, is in order for this particular issue.
Okay. So, John, how can human rights frameworks adapt to remain resilient amid rising authoritarianism and evolving societal norms?
Well, first and foremost, the highest priority needs to be getting funds and other support to frontline human rights defenders, a lot of people in this room, and other elements of civil society, to support operational costs, to legal defense, to transnational networking like what we're doing today, to coalition building. Let's give them the tools and resources to lead the defense of human rights and humanitarianism around the world. And I think Aurora has a key role to play in all that. Another important part of the strategy, though, is to recognize the centrality of human rights campaigns, focused, I think, on reputational risk of the actors involved. There have been some amazing campaigns that have moved companies deeply complicit in human rights abuses to change their behavior. Many of us know of the Nike targeting for abuses and for abusing and exploiting their workers in their supply chains over the years. The targeting of De Beers for their near monopoly on blood diamonds. Apple was targeted for its sourcing of conflict minerals in the aforementioned Congo, sourcing the minerals that are so fundamentally important to our laptops and cell phones. And all of these three companies and so many more have altered their policies and behavior fairly dramatically in response to sustained consumer pressure, people like us in this room who care about human rights at the core. So I'd like to share a story about one of these campaigns, especially for students here, who are thinking about how they can get involved and making a difference.
Apple, you know, as I said, sourcing the minerals for its main products from war zones in the DRC. And they were one of the worst companies in terms of denying any responsibility whatsoever for fueling conflict due to the purchasing of the minerals, its supply chain, and how that supply chain was controlled by armed groups who were responsible for some of the deadliest violence in the world. And this is at the time the conflict was the deadliest war in the world since World War II, the highest rates of sexual violence in the world. The list goes on. So our little band of non-governmental organizations and student groups, in coalition and coordination with groups on the ground in Congo, got our slingshots out and started aiming them at the Goliath of Apple to see if we could get them to pay attention to this issue. And we were undoubtedly annoying to Apple, but in all honesty, they were too small to move the needle. But things happen. And Wired magazine at the time had a feature where every month or so, Steve Jobs, still alive and was the president and CEO of Apple at the time, would answer one letter to the editor of Wired. And one of our constituents wrote in about what was going on in Congo and how Apple was complicit, the conflict of minerals and all that. And it was selected somehow, whoever selected, as the one that Steve Jobs would answer that month. And the answer he did, he completely dismissed the premise that Apple had any responsibility, again, doubling down on their corporate social responsibilities, people's answer. His response was so factually inaccurate that we decided we'd write our own letter to the magazine to correct the record, and we CC'd the email address that they always put in that feature, sjobs@apple.com, just for fun. And we hit send on our letter, and being pretty demoralized, we just moved on. But 10 minutes later, an incoming missile lands in our inbox from sjobs@apple.com. We have no idea at the time, like, whose really this is. I mean, imagining that Apple has like an army of PR people on the lookout for any incipient threat to Apple's brand and reputation. But this S. Jobs was steaming mad. And he tells us he wants a phone call at such and such a time, which happens to be late on a Friday night, but we're NGO people, so we got nothing going on. And again, you know, so this is our chance to like engage with the electronics industry leader at whatever level who would get on the phone, so we had to do it. Friday night comes, the phone rings, and we're like, there's 5 of us around the speakerphone, and it sure sounds like Steve Jobs, and he's furious that we're besmirching Apple's reputation, but he's also extremely curious. He wants to fully understand the situation, but he's most angry because he's been crushingly misinformed about the role that Apple plays and what the supply chain actually involves in Central Africa. So he quizzes us hard for about an hour, and then he gives us like a fairly elaborate assignment to answer a bunch of questions by Monday morning. Remember, this is Friday night. By Monday morning, he wants the answers on his desk and then hangs up. So we spend the entire weekend, because again, we have nothing going on, answering his questions, and we send him the document Monday morning, and the next thing we know, he basically tells us to get on a plane, come to Cupertino, Apple headquarters. So we get there, get escorted up to a beautiful conference room with a sort of a testimonial to Steve Jobs' kind of innovations in the world. And there's Tim Cook and a bunch of the other senior Apple leadership, and in waltzes Steve Jobs with his famous black sweater and his New Balance sneakers and his jeans, and he puts his feet up on the thing and he just starts attacking. And we have a 2-hour, very contentious, I've led the league in every basketball league I've played in, I led the league in technical fouls, so I don't take this kind of stuff very easily. And so we were back and forth at each other, table pounding, nothing to lose. And at the end of it, he says, all right, I buy 2/3 of what you're saying. And then he proceeds, doesn't even look at Tim Cook or any of these other people, it just makes the decisions for Apple. And he proceeds to make these massive changes in how Apple would source its minerals going forward, prioritizing transparency, working to remove conflict out of the supply chain. It was just a stunning thing to be part of. And Apple's changes then forced all the other electronics companies begrudgingly to have to change their supply chain policies. And then at the time, thanks to Gale and others, the Obama administration had was in the process of taking a number of actions, particularly putting pressure on Rwanda, much more than pressure, removing aid from Rwanda to alter its policies. And the U.S. Congress got involved in a bipartisan, incredible, cross-aisle collaboration between the various kind of key people in the Senate and the House, and for a number of years reduced extreme violence in those mining areas for a number of years. Now, there have been some regression recently because people have lost their interest, but it just shows you the power of this, of collective action. And I can't help but remember the quote from Dorothy Day, and I know many of you know where I'm going, that so inspired me when I was a young person trying to figure out, what my life of activism would be. And she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And I think that belief undoubtedly kind of drew Vartan and Rubin and Newbar to found Aurora and what brings us all here today.
That's an amazing story. Okay, so we are close to wrapping up. I wanted to ask each of you this question. 1 year from today, what sign would give you hope that human rights protections are advancing globally? Anna, would you like to begin?
1 year from today. If we think about a year ago, none of us could have predicted this time that we've been in. I would say that I would like to see a resurgence of interest in human rights among the public of the world. So for America, it's reviving our human rights movement in this country, wherever you are. This is a conversation for people, for all of us. It's something that we talk about with one another, and we make it more accessible and more real, as something we can all touch. It's something we don't wait for the government to give us. We don't just protest and demand. We create. That's what I would like to see.
Great answer. Safiya?
I work on tech regulation. That's important to me. I think we've seen a lot of the work of the last decade that's been incredibly incremental anyway, rolled back in the last 100 days. So I'd like to see, I think if we saw accountability of our own government right now via a variety of different kinds of mechanisms, that would be incredible. That would be an amazing start. And I think that's absolutely possible. And I think if we had, much greater transparency and linkage between the role of investors and industry with human rights abuses and civil rights rollbacks, including DEI rollbacks. I think if we could have total clarity and agenda building around that, that would be great progress, and it feels incredibly urgent.
Thank you. Unni, how about you?
1 year from now, if students can protest without any fear, and they, the courts have their back and they have constitutional protections, and 1 year from now, if humanitarians, journalists can go to, places where there are problems and can come back alive and not be always under fear of attack. And there's outrage if that happens. And there is outrage locally, nationally, globally. Then I think the needle is moving. Right now, all of this is being normalized. Mm-hmm. And we need to sort of unnormalize these sort of violations of constitutional rights, violations of humanitarian law, so on and so forth.
Thank you. John?
Well, like they said, and I hope in a year we're seeing the pendulum swinging back away from elected authoritarianism towards globalism, towards humanitarianism, and a desire to protect the planet and the people in it.
Thank you very much.
That's right.
So, as we've heard from our panelists, the future of human rights will be shaped not only by institutions and legal frameworks, but by how boldly we reimagine our shared responsibilities across borders, disciplines, and generations. These conversations are just beginning, and thank you for your doses of optimism. Thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause.